Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to another lesson in the Designing VMware Infrastructure video training series. This lesson talks about designing the management layer. Here's a quick look at the outline for this lesson. We'll start out with reviewing some broad management strategies. Our discussion of these broad management strategies will be from the perspective of looking at their advantages and disadvantages and impacts on the overall design. Next, we'll move into a discussion of how our management layer design has to incorporate security solutions, as well as how our management layer design needs to incorporate backup and availability solutions. Following that, we'll move on to a discussion of how our management layer needs to accommodate other management components as dictated by our design factors. And finally, we'll wrap up the lesson with a look at identifying dependencies and impacts. In this, we'll be revisiting the idea of the complex interrelationships that exist between different components in the design, and how as an architect we need to be intimately familiar with and aware of those relationships as we go through the design. Let's get started. In looking at designing the management layer, I believe that there are three basic or three broad management strategies that exist for how you go about crafting the management layer for your VMware infrastructure. I have classified these as virtualized in-band management, virtualized out-of-band management, and physical management. As with any other decision that you make when designing a VMware infrastructure environment, each of these strategies has its own set of advantages and disadvantages. And your job as the architect or the designer of the environment will be to evaluate these advantages and disadvantages against the design factors in order to determine which management strategy is best suited for your particular environment. In the next few slides, I'm going to review each of these three broad management strategies and try to provide some context around the advantages, disadvantages, and impacts that these management strategies might have on your environment. The first management strategy that I want to take a look at is what I've termed the virtualized in-band management strategy. In this case, what we have is we have the management infrastructure running on top of the same VMware infrastructure that it is managing. It is in-band to the infrastructure that it's managing. This is accomplished by taking a virtualized instance of vCenter Server, which could be either an installation of vCenter Server on Windows Server or an instance of the vCenter Server appliance that runs on Linux, and running that on the hypervisor and on a set of hypervisors that it in turn manages. So you have the management running on the same infrastructure that it's managing. This is a fully supported strategy and is widely used. It has, as with every technology decision, its own advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages that it offers, or perhaps I should say one of the disadvantages that you have to account for in your design, is the fact that if something happens to the underlying infrastructure, that could in turn affect the management layer, which could then affect the rest of the infrastructure. So you could have an escalation here if something happens that takes the management layer out. So you have to carefully design for the appropriate redundancy and recoverability of the management infrastructure so that an error underneath it doesn't cause it to become unavailable. However, as I said, this is a very common management strategy. One of the advantages that it does offer is that it does not require any additional infrastructure. You can leverage the infrastructure that you have in place, so you don't need additional servers, you don't need additional storage above and beyond what your VMware environment already would require. For that reason, it's commonly seen and commonly deployed and a widely used strategy. However, it's not the only strategy, so let's take a look at our second strategy. In the second strategy, which I've termed virtualized out-of-band management, we're still using a virtualized instance of vCenter Server, and again, this can still be either an installation of vCenter Server on an instance of Windows Server, or it can be an instance of the vCenter Server Linux-based appliance. But in this particular case, instead of running the management components on the same infrastructure that it manages, there's a separate set of management infrastructure that runs these components. So we have some additional resources, and you can see here I've depicted some additional physical resources and then running the management components still virtualized on this separate infrastructure. This removes the potential concern that I mentioned with the in-band management strategy of having problems in the underlying infrastructure potentially escalate into the management and then be spread from there. However, as you can clearly see from the diagram, this does have a disadvantage in that it requires additional hardware components. You have to have more servers or a separate cluster of servers. However, given certain design factors such as size or other management components, this is a perfectly valid design, and again, one that is seen commonly in many environments. This is our second management strategy, virtualized out of band, because our management is virtualized, but it is not on the infrastructure that it's managing. Let's now take a look at the third management strategy. The third management strategy is physical management. In this particular case, we still have separate infrastructure, but this is physical infrastructure now. We have an instance of vCenter Server running on a non-virtualized operating system instance. So we're actually running something like Windows Server on the bare metal without the benefit of a hypervisor, and we've installed vCenter Server rather into that copy of Windows Server. Note that we can't use the vCenter Server Linux appliance here because that does require and presume the presence of a hypervisor. And while this management strategy offers some benefits in that it might be simpler to manage this management infrastructure, it also offers some fairly significant drawbacks in that you lose all the advantages of having a hypervisor present. So the management components can't take advantage of live migrations or DRS or HA or any of the other pieces that a hypervisor and vCenter Server bring to the table. All the reasons that you embraced virtualization, for example. So there are some fairly significant drawbacks. Nevertheless, this is a potential management strategy that you or your customers might want to pursue if the design factors lead you in that direction. Regardless of which management strategy you select in crafting your management layer, you'll still need to address some common questions. One of the most important common questions you'll have to address is how you're going to handle the management databases. You know already that vCenter Server requires a backend database. That backend database could be Oracle, it could be Microsoft SQL Server, it could be DB2. The vCenter Server Linux appliance has its own embedded database as well. If you're going to deploy something like vSphere Update Manager, or VUM, you're going to need a database for that as well. If the design factors dictate that you're going to deploy something like vCloud Director, that will also require a database. And so regardless of whether you're doing virtualized in-band management or virtualized out-of-band management or even physical management, in all three cases we still have to determine how we're going to handle the databases, and we have to answer questions in our management design like which database we're going to use. Are we going to use Oracle? Are we going to use Microsoft SQL? Are we going to use IBM DB2? And keep in mind that different components have different database compatibility matrices that you must be aware of. Where are we going to run those databases? Are those databases going to be local or remote to the management components that they support? So are you going to run the vCenter Server database on the same operating system instance or in the same operating system instance as vCenter Server itself? Or will you run it on a separate instance? Will it be therefore local or will it be remote? Are you going to run the database physical or are you going to run the database virtual? And that decision also has a number of design impacts on the design. Should you choose to run it physical, you'll need to account for the availability and redundancy of the database. Should you choose to run the database virtually, then you'll have to account for performance and redundancy and recoverability. So, important questions here that have to be addressed regardless of the management strategy that you choose, because these questions are common to all three management strategies. Another part of crafting the management layer for your VMware infrastructure is incorporating the security solutions that you've selected to meet the design factors. In the lesson titled Building Security into the Logical Design, I discussed with you the process of evaluating the design factors and selecting security solutions to satisfy those design factors. Now you have to account for how those security solutions will affect the management layer as you incorporate those security solutions into the management layer, and you're also going to want to account for the security of the management layer itself. being sure that you adhere to any security-related design factors as you craft the management layer. You're going to want to make sure that you understand the impact that incorporating these security solutions will have on the management layer, and that is something that you can gain a measure and understanding of by asking and answering questions such as the ones displayed on your screen. For example, are additional management components necessary in order to accommodate the security solutions? If I have to accommodate a security solution like vCloud Director because I'm being driven by design factors that require multi-tenancy or isolation of tenants away from resources, how will that affect my management layer? Will I have to add additional management components in order to account for adding that into my design? And further, what will the impact be from adding those components in order to account for the security solution? So we have multiple layers of impacts that we must assess and attempt to understand. Second, you can ask and answer the question, how do the security requirements shape the management layer? If I have a requirement that says multiple or separate authentication sources are required, how will that affect the management layer? If I have a security requirement that says that certain network traffic must be segregated, how will that affect the management layer? If I have a requirement that says that the management layer must be secured over the network, how will that affect the management layer's design? So how do we look at how the management layer is shaped by security requirements? These are the kinds of questions that you need to ask and be able to answer in the design that you're creating. Similarly to the discussion on incorporating security solutions, now is also the time in which you will incorporate your backup and availability solutions. Recall from the lesson titled Specifying Backup and Availability in the Logical Design that I discussed with you how we go about selecting backup and availability solutions for your VMware infrastructure. And now as you incorporate those backup and availability solutions into the management layer's design, we again have to account for the impact of incorporating those solutions. And we have to ensure that the management layer itself is also properly protected with regards to backup and availability, that the management layer itself is available enough and that it is being backed up. Once again, we can look at a set of questions to ask ourselves in an effort to understand the effect and the impact of incorporating these solutions into management design. For example, what management components are affected, if any? Should I choose to use in-guest backups, what management components will be affected, if any? Should I choose to use hypervisor level backups, what management components will be affected, if any? Will one management strategy be more affected than another based on a backup and availability solutions? For example, should I choose a physical management strategy, how does that affect my ability or the design's ability to provide the right level of availability to the design? Would the physical management strategy be more affected by availability requirements than, say, the virtualized in-band management strategy? And finally, you can ask and answer the question, are additional management components necessary? Do I need to add additional management components in order to account for a particular backup or availability requirement found in the design factors? And if I do need to add additional management components, what is the impact on the management layer design of needing to add those components? Multiple layers of impacts being seen here as we attempt to understand and account for the incorporation of the backup and availability solutions into the management layer's design. Building on that thought of incorporating additional management components, I've already discussed what might happen if we had to incorporate something like vCloud Director into our management layer design. We might also need to account for impacts from the incorporation of solutions such as Site Recovery Manager or vShield Manager into the management layer design. Each of these solutions will have its own impact, its own effect on the management layer design, and you as the architect need to understand what those impacts will be or could be and how we address them if they need to be addressed. So again, ask yourself questions such as, what components will be affected? How will those components be affected? And how do I address the effects of having these components added to the design? As you look at how you craft the management layer in such a way to not only incorporate the security solutions and not only incorporate the backup and availability solutions, but also address the need for additional management components above and beyond just vCenter Server, including things like vCloud Director, Site Recovery Manager, vShield Manager, vCenter Orchestrator, and others. Once more, we want to take a look at identifying dependencies and impacts in the design. Our role as an architect is to understand the interrelationships and dependencies between various components in the design. And so we again want to revisit the idea of looking at how different components affect other components and what those effects may be. We'll turn once more to the idea of a mind map and looking at this mind map and breaking down some of the areas that are involved in a management layer design. We see that there are lots of other areas that could be affected. If we focus in, for example, just on vCenter Server placement, where is it going to be? Is it going to run physical or virtual? This can have an impact on a variety of areas, sometimes unexpected areas. It'll affect your backup strategy. If it's going to be physical, then you need to account for that, and you can't rely on hypervisor level backups, for example. It will affect your financial constraints. If it's going to be out of band, we have to account for the additional infrastructure required to run the virtualized out-of-band management components. It affects your operational processes. Managing a virtualized vCenter Server instance or a vCenter Server Linux-based appliance would be different than managing a physical vCenter Server instance. And so there will be an impact on operational processes, for example. It will even affect your physical and virtual network designs and could affect other management components depending on where it's placed and how it interacts with those other management components. This is just one example, and I'll leave it to you to look at the rest of the mind map and come up with some specific examples. But this is just one side of a two-sided coin. We want to be able to identify dependencies. We want to be able to identify other areas that could be affected. But not only do we want to identify other areas that could be affected, we also want to identify what effects could be seen. In other words, if the physical network design could be affected by vCenter Server placement, what are the specific impacts or the specific things that will happen or could happen to the physical network design as a result of vCenter Server placement? So I'd like to show you another diagram that I've created that attempts to help bring that to the front. This diagram that you're seeing now is a diagram that I created in an attempt to map out some of the dependencies and impacts between various major design decisions in the management layer. Now, I will immediately admit that this diagram is incomplete. It doesn't include every single decision in the management layer design, and it cannot possibly hope to capture all of the interrelationships and dependencies between all of the components in the management layer design. But it will highlight some of the major ones, and from there you can extrapolate to other impacts and dependencies. But it looks at questions like, will vCenter Server be virtual or physical? And then based on the answer to that question, you can see that it affects things like which database engine it's going to use, where the database is going to run, how the management network is going to be accomplished. Will it run on Windows or in the Linux-based virtual appliance? Is it going to run in-band or out-of-band? In short, that one question affects every other question in the management design. And this diagram is intended to help shape your thought processes to begin thinking about how these components are so interrelated with one another. Now, you don't have to go to the level of creating Visio diagrams, although you certainly can if that helps you. My point in showing you this and discussing it here in the course is really to get your mind thinking along the lines of constantly assessing impacts from design decisions and making sure that you know how a particular portion of a design might affect other portions of a design and what those effects could possibly be. Without an understanding of dependencies and impacts, I believe that your effectiveness as an architect in designing VMware environments will be impaired. It's a critical skill. Wrapping up this lesson now, let's review the topics that we touched upon. We started out with a review of some broad management strategies. These were the broad strategies that I described as a virtualized in-band, a virtualized out-of-band, and physical. And I talked with you about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these approaches. We then next talked about incorporating security solutions into the management layer's design and how we have to go about accommodating those security solutions and addressing the impact of incorporating them. Likewise with incorporating backup and availability solutions into the management layer's design. Next, we discussed how we go about accommodating other design components and trying to understand the effect on the management layer design that would be created as a result of accommodating those components. And we wrapped up the lesson with a discussion of dependencies and impacts, and I showed you another tool, another diagram, or another way of looking at relationships and dependencies between design decisions and design areas. That concludes this lesson in the Designing VMware Infrastructure video training series. Thanks for watching.